Emily Foster, Jessica Hayes, Megan Carter. All three women were beloved in Willow Creek, known for their warmth, kindness, and bright futures. But in the span of just a few months, they were found dead, each one in the same eerily calm manner, left in the woods like pieces in a twisted puzzle. No signs of struggle, no obvious injuries, just an unsettling stillness. And the most chilling part? The man everyone thought they knew, the quiet mechanic Richie Turner, had been hiding in plain sight. But what if the killer wasn't a stranger, but someone you'd known your entire life? Someone who had been right there with you all along. Willow Creek was a town where life moved slowly. Situated in the heart of the Midwest, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where neighbors chatted over fences and people waved to each other as they passed by. The streets were quiet, the air crisp, and the sound of birdsong was often the loudest noise you'd hear. It was a town where secrets were hard to keep because the walls between people were thin, and curiosity ran deep. If something unusual happened, the whole town would know within hours, and that's what made what happened so unfathomable. It all began with the disappearance of Emily Foster, a 22-year-old waitress at the local diner. She was known for her bright smile and bubbly personality. Emily had grown up in Willow Creek, and she seemed like the type of person who would always be around, greeting customers with a warm hello and a pot of coffee. But one Thursday morning, Emily didn't show up for her shift. At first, people thought she had just overslept or was dealing with some personal issue. It wasn't uncommon for someone to miss work every now and then. Life in a small town didn't always follow a predictable schedule. But when she didn't turn up the next day, the worry began to creep in. Her parents, desperate and frantic, went to the sheriff's office to report her missing. The sheriff, a man named Gary Adams who had served the town for over 30 years, knew everyone in town and had seen more than his fair share of missing person reports. Still, something about this case felt different. Emily wasn't the type of person to vanish without a trace. She was loved by everyone. There were no signs of trouble, no warning signs that she was unhappy or had any reason to disappear. The town rallied together, putting up flyers, organizing search parties, and scouring the woods around Willow Creek, hoping to find any clue that would lead them to her. For days there was no sign of Emily. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Sheriff Adams kept everyone informed, but there were no leads, no tips from anyone who had seen or heard anything unusual. The woods were vast, and the terrain made it difficult for searchers to cover ground quickly. But then, almost a week after Emily's disappearance, a local hiker stumbled across something that would change everything. Hidden deep in the woods, just a mile from the edge of town, Emily's body was found. She was lying on the forest floor, her body unnervingly still. There were no obvious signs of injury, no blood, no bruises, no broken bones. The only unusual thing was the way she had been positioned, almost as if placed there carefully. The sheriff's office was shocked. This was no random accident. It wasn't just a case of someone wandering off and getting lost in the woods. Something more sinister was at play. But the lack of physical evidence left everyone grasping at straws. No fingerprints, no weapon, nothing that could point to a suspect, and most troubling of all, no one had seen a thing. The town of Willow Creek, once a place of peace and routine, suddenly found itself in the grip of fear. There was a killer among them, and no one knew who it was. Rumors started to spread. People began to wonder if someone they knew was capable of such violence. The air that once felt so fresh and clean now felt heavy, suffocating. As the days passed, the question that haunted everyone was no longer just where Emily was, it was who would be next. As the days turned into weeks, The unsettling feeling that had gripped Willow Creek only deepened. Emily Foster's murder wasn't just a tragedy. It was the beginning of something much darker. The town had been rocked to its core, but no one expected what would come next. Sheriff Gary Adams, a man who had spent his entire career keeping the peace in a town where violent crime was almost unheard of, found himself staring at a case that seemed impossible to solve. At first, the community tried to move on. People went back to work, kids went back to school, and the routines of daily life began to reassert themselves. But beneath the surface, there was a growing sense of unease. The police were still tight-lipped about the details of Emily's murder, but the lack of answers made everyone feel more vulnerable. Rumors spread faster than any official statement could keep up with, and fear began to infect the very air of Willow Creek. Then, a month later, the second body was found. Jessica Hayes, a 29-year-old high school teacher, had been missing for 3 days before her body was discovered in the same woods where Emily had been found. The location was eerily similar, deep in the forest, far from any main trail, her body carefully positioned in a clearing, as though placed there with purpose. Jessica, like Emily, showed no signs of physical trauma. No stab wounds, no gunshots, no bruises. The only visible mark was a faint indentation on her neck, suggesting strangulation. But that wasn't enough to explain the cause of death with certainty. Sheriff Adams couldn't shake the growing suspicion that these were no random killings. The pattern was too clear to ignore. 2 women, both well known in the community, both found in the same remote area, both without any apparent reason for their deaths. The investigation that had initially seemed like an isolated case now looked like the beginning of something much more disturbing. Could Willow Creek have a serial killer? The townspeople were in shock. Jessica had been a beloved teacher at the local high school, known for her dedication to her students and her warm demeanor. She had no known enemies, and her personal life seemed perfectly normal. She wasn't involved in any strange or risky behavior. But just like Emily, she had been taken from them without warning or explanation, and now the fear that had started with Emily's disappearance began to spread like wildfire. At first, there was a whisper of relief when investigators ruled out a connection between the 2 women. Perhaps this was the work of a transient, someone from outside of Willow Creek who had slipped through the cracks. But that theory was quickly squashed when another body was discovered, a 3rd victim, just weeks after Jessica Hayes. Megan Carter, a 24-year-old librarian, had disappeared on a Sunday afternoon. Her body was found in the same stretch of woods, lying in a similar position, showing the same signs of strangulation. This time there was a subtle difference. The rope used to bind her hands was white and thin, almost like twine. It was the kind of detail that might have been overlooked if not for the growing pattern of the previous deaths. As the 3rd victim was added to the growing list, Sheriff Adams's worst fears began to take shape. This wasn't random. Whoever was responsible had a plan, and the more the town tried to make sense of it, the more elusive the answers seemed to be. The fear and suspicion that had already begun to fracture the tight-knit community turned into full-blown paranoia. No one felt safe anymore. People began to look over their shoulders, wonder who might be watching them. Could someone they knew, someone they trusted, be capable of such violence? There were no suspects, no real clues, and as the bodies mounted, it became increasingly clear that this wasn't just a series of tragic, isolated deaths. Something deeper, something darker was happening in Willow Creek. But the killer was still out there, blending into the background of everyday life, and no one could predict who would be next. As the town of Willow Creek reeled from the horror of the third murder, the pressure on Sheriff Gary Adams and his small team of investigators became unbearable. Each new body pushed the town further into a state of panic. People were no longer just worried about who might be next. They were wondering if they were living next to the killer, working alongside him, or even socializing with him at the local bar. The idea that someone from within the town was responsible felt like a disease creeping through the community, making everyone question everything they knew about each other. In the weeks that followed, the investigation took a new direction. Sheriff Adams knew the killer had a plan, that much was clear. The victims were all women, all seemingly random in their individual lives, but connected by their shared presence in Willow Creek. Yet there had to be more to it. The strangulation, the careful placement of the bodies, and now the white rope. It was too methodical to be mere chance. The killer was watching them, waiting, and each death seemed to be part of a sickening ritual. Detective Sarah Lee, a recent addition to the sheriff's department and a newcomer to the town, suggested they start looking at the connections between the victims, especially their pasts. If the killer was local, it made sense that there was a link between these women, something hidden beneath the surface that no one had thought to explore. They were all around the same age, all had attended the same high school, and each had been relatively well known in the community. But that was still too vague, too abstract to offer any real leads. What they needed was something concrete. The more they dug, the more it became clear that their investigation was missing a crucial element, a link to the past. So they decided to revisit the high school yearbooks, digging through decades-old photographs and records. That's when they started to notice patterns. The women, though not close friends, had been part of overlapping social circles. They had been in the same classes, attended some of the same events, and, most disturbingly, all of them had been popular in their own right. Each of them had been admired, but none of them had ever been the center of the school's social scene. Sheriff Adams and Detective Lee began to pull records of everyone who had graduated during the same years as the victims, focusing particularly on those who had been in the same classes or who might have been connected to the women in some way. It didn't take long before they stumbled upon something unsettling, an old, forgotten name. Richie Turner. Richie had been a star athlete in high school, a basketball player who had been admired by his peers for his natural ability and charm. He had been the golden boy, the type of person everyone assumed would go on to do great things. But after high school, his life had unraveled. He dropped out of college, struggled to find work, and eventually came back to Willow Creek, where he took up a modest job as a mechanic. He was still known by most people in town, but his star had long faded. At first, it seemed like an odd lead. Richie Turner didn't seem like the type of person who would commit murder. He was well liked by everyone who knew him, and there was no record of any criminal activity. But the more the team dug into his background, the more it became clear that his relationship with the town's women wasn't as innocent as it appeared. Richie had been obsessed with the women who had outshined him during high school. Emily, Jessica, and Megan had all been a part of the popular crowd, the ones who had received attention from their peers, while Richie had faded into the background after his basketball career ended. Had the years of resentment and jealousy festered into something far more dangerous? But there was still one critical piece missing: motive. Why had Richie chosen these particular women, and why now, so many years after high school? Was it revenge, or was there something more twisted at play? Sheriff Adams and Detective Lee knew they had to focus on Richie. Every other theory they had explored had come up empty, and the increasing pattern of the murders, coupled with Richie's connection to the victims, made it hard to ignore the possibility that he might be the killer. But as they closed in on him, another layer of complexity emerged. Richie had never been arrested, never had a record of violent behavior. The small-town gossip about his downward spiral didn't explain the level of careful planning in each murder. Was he truly capable of such brutality? The deeper they delved into his life, the more it became clear that Richie wasn't just a man with a past. He was someone haunted by it, and perhaps that had driven him to commit unspeakable acts. But the truth was still out there, and Willow Creek was running out of time to find it. The breakthrough came when the investigation seemed to stall completely, just when the town's anxiety reached its peak. Sheriff Gary Adams and Detective Sarah Lee had been poring over Richie Turner's life for weeks, but nothing concrete had emerged. He was clean. No criminal history, no known violent tendencies. Everyone in Willow Creek still saw him as the charming, quiet guy who had fixed their cars, waved at them from his porch, and hung out at the local bar. The image of the killer was still slipping through their fingers like smoke. It wasn't until a young local teenager, Jesse Carter, offered a strange tip that things finally shifted. Jesse, a 16-year-old who had grown up in Willow Creek but always felt like an outsider, had a reputation for being observant, sometimes too much for her own good. She spent most of her time reading in the park or walking around the edges of the woods where the bodies had been found. Her parents had no idea how often she ventured near the areas where the murders had taken place. But one evening, Jessie was certain she had seen someone. "I think I saw someone watching," she said to Sheriff Adams one afternoon, her voice wavering with unease. "Near the trees, behind the diner. It was dark, but I saw a man standing there. I didn't see his face, just his outline. He was tall, and he wore a hoodie." Sheriff Adams took the tip seriously, though it seemed too vague to lead to anything solid. The only thing they could work with was Jesse's description: tall, a hoodie, and lurking at the edge of town. It was hardly a description that could lead them to a suspect, but it was the first real clue they had in weeks. With no other leads, they decided to search the wooded areas again, focusing on places where people didn't typically venture. That's when Detective Lee made an unexpected discovery. While retracing the paths near the woods, she found a small, weathered notebook wedged between the roots of a tree. The notebook was thin, the pages yellowed with age, and the handwriting was tight and obsessive. At first glance, it appeared to be a collection of random thoughts, jotted down like a diary. But when Sarah began reading, the unnerving reality of what it contained became clear. This was the killer's journal. The entries were cryptic, filled with strange phrases and eerie references to completion and perfection. The first few pages were disjointed, filled with ramblings about waiting for the right moment and setting things in motion. But as the entries went on, they became more coherent. The words 5 and Fascination appeared repeatedly. It was clear that the killer was keeping track of his crimes, but the chilling part was that the notebook's last entry stated, 5 when it's done. I'll be free. Detective Lee's stomach twisted as she realized that this was no random killing spree. The killer had been planning his murders, each one part of a larger, twisted vision. He wasn't just taking lives, he was creating a ritual, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events that, in his mind, would somehow bring him peace or closure. There was no doubt now. The killer was counting victims. The more they examined the journal, the clearer the connection to Richie Turner became. There was a certain method to the madness in the handwriting, an obsessive, calculating nature that aligned disturbingly well with what they knew about Richie's life. Though he had never been arrested for anything violent, Richie had long been seen as a person who was obsessed with perfection. He had always been one of those people who could never let go of his past, the type to revisit old photos, reminisce about his glory days as the high school basketball star, and linger on what could have been. The journal had a strange, almost personal quality to it, as if the writer was speaking directly to someone. "She never saw it coming," one of the entries read, referring to one of the victims, Emily Foster. Another entry described the beauty of the moment, right after another murder. It was as if the killer was reliving each crime in vivid detail, savoring his triumphs in a sickening, voyeuristic way. But perhaps the most disturbing part of the journal was its last entry. It was signed with a name, Richie Turner. The pieces were falling into place. Richie had been living right under their noses, hiding in plain sight. The notebook, with its cryptic notes and obsessive language, was proof that he was the killer. Sheriff Adams and Detective Lee felt the weight of the discovery, knowing that they now had the evidence they needed to confront him. But there was one thing they still didn't know. Was he truly finished with his sick plan, or was there more to come? The fear that had plagued Willow Creek for weeks now turned into an undeniable sense of urgency. Richie Turner wasn't just some quiet mechanic with a past. He was a calculated, methodical killer, and it was time to stop him before anyone else could become part of his twisted obsession. The arrest of Richie Turner sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. The town that had once been the epitome of tranquility was now a place of fear and disbelief. Richie had been the last person anyone suspected. He was familiar, even liked by most. His life seemingly a steady, albeit unremarkable, continuation of the past. The man who fixed your car, waved to you at the grocery store, or spoke kindly to your children in passing. To most, he was a friend, a neighbor, a face that blended into the everyday fabric of the small town. No one could have ever imagined the twisted depths that hid behind his easy smile. When Sheriff Adams and Detective Lee confronted Richie, it was almost anticlimactic. He didn't resist arrest. There was no panic, no defiance. Richie simply sat at the mechanic's desk, where he'd spent countless hours, his hands folded on top of an old repair manual, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. His eyes were vacant, almost detached, as if he were finally free of some heavy weight that had been crushing him for years. His confession came quietly, almost apologetically, as if he were explaining an abstract concept, rather than admitting to a series of brutal murders. Richie told them that the deaths had been part of a larger plan, a personal mission he had spent years cultivating, and that the end, his freedom, was almost within reach. His words were chilling in their calmness, as though he were recounting the events of a trivial afternoon rather than describing the pain and terror he had inflicted on his victims and their families. Richie explained that the women he had chosen were not random. They were symbols, pieces in a puzzle he had been assembling for years. Emily, Jessica, Megan. They had been classmates, familiar faces from a time when he had been someone else, someone adored, someone who had it all. But after high school, Richie's life had taken a different turn. He had been overlooked, forgotten, and the resentment began to build. At first, it was a small bitterness, those fleeting thoughts of why didn't she ever notice me, or why did they get all the attention while I was left in the shadows? But that bitterness had grown. Over time, it became a consuming obsession. He had kept track of the women from high school, watching them from afar, keeping a record of their lives. He noticed how they moved on, how they thrived while he was stuck in a small town, repairing cars, living in the faded glory of his past. He thought of the murders as a kind of cleansing, a way to reset the balance. In his twisted mind, the violence he inflicted was not only justified but necessary. He believed that with each life he took, he was completing a part of himself, fulfilling a need that had festered for far too long. The notebook they had found was the key to understanding his madness. Richie explained that it was his final draft. It had started as a journal of thoughts, frustrations, and failed attempts to reach out to the women he thought he had a connection with. But as time went on, it evolved into a record of his crimes, each victim marking a step in his strange ritual. He described each murder as a perfect moment, a feeling of completion that surged through him as he took the lives of those he once admired, those who had never noticed him. His mind had twisted the concept of perfection until it was nothing more than a path of blood. But it wasn't the murders themselves that seemed to have driven him. It was the idea of control, of having the power to make everything right in his mind. The final victim, the fifth one, he hadn't named her yet, but she would have been the last in his plan. Richie never had the chance to finish what he started. In the weeks following his arrest, Willow Creek's sense of security was shattered. The town's identity had been built on familiarity, on knowing who everyone was and trusting that the people around you could be relied upon. The idea that someone like Richie, someone who had been so ingrained in their community, was capable of such horror, left them disillusioned. The shock wasn't just in the brutality of the murders. It was in the realization that the killer had always been there, hidden in plain sight. The trial was swift and the evidence overwhelming. Richie Turner pled guilty to all 5 murders, and his sentence was clear: life in prison without the possibility of parole. But that didn't erase the damage done. The families of the victims were left to pick up the pieces, haunted by the fact that the man responsible for their daughters' deaths had been one of their own. As for Willow Creek, the scars remained. No one spoke of Richie Turner in the same way again, and the quiet streets were no longer as peaceful as they once were. Years later, people would still whisper about the murders, about the man they had once trusted. Richie had become more than just a criminal. He had become a symbol of the town's greatest fear, that evil could hide behind even the most familiar faces, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. The case haunted Willow Creek, and the fascination with Richie's twisted motives lingered long after the trial was over, leaving the town forever changed. No one could ever quite shake the thought, if someone like Richie could be a killer, then what about the others, those you thought you knew so well?